They just had dudes coming out in full prison outfits, like real prison outfits, holding actual fucking Uzis and AKs. Like they weren't cardboard. And I have no idea if they were loaded. I would fucking hope they weren't. But like, I was like, whoa. Like, I was a little kid and I was like, damn, those are guns.
I'm a writer. I know dialogue.
That's a fountain of conversation, man. That's a geyser.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yes, provocative.
Oh, Daddy, stand back, man. Woo! Rock and roll!
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Find the podcast at bookedonrock.com. You can find every episode of Booked on Rock there, along with links to your favorite listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, links to all of the social media sites, and the latest rock book releases. It's another chapter in the dialogue series, a chill and chat with musicians, authors, fellow podcasters, listeners, and more. Our guest is Frank Meyer. Frank is an award-winning musician, director, and author from Los Angeles. He's best known for his vocal work with Rock and Roll Hall of Famer James Williamson of Iggy and the Stooges, his rock band the Streetwalkin Cheetahs, and his studio and road work with cult legends Wayne Kramer of MC5, Cherie Currie of the Runaways, Sylvain Sylvain of New York Dolls, Cheetah Chrome of Dead Boys, just to name a few. He's got a brand new documentary feature film out now called Freestyle 101 Hip Hop History. We'll talk about that, along with just some of the many, many stories he has to tell. Frank saw the metal band Body Count perform a concert where they brought actual Uzis on stage. He got to see Axl Rose around 1984 when he was an unknown singing in a band called Rapid Fire. He later caught a pretty famous Axl and Slash backstage at an MTV Video Awards show, stealing food from a catering line. We talked the raw side of Eddie Van Halen, why Frank would love to see Van Halen bassist Michael Anthony write a book, and what he'd want to be in it. We wind down with a discussion of Keith Richards and the latest Rolling Stones album, Hackney Diamonds. Here is Frank Meyer. Frank, welcome back to the podcast, man. What's going on?
Not much, man. How you doing?
I got to applaud you because you're the very, very, very first guest on this podcast.
Well, thank you. My God, I guess I didn't realize that I was the first guest. Meaning now that you say that, I gotta say I'm pretty proud of myself.
2 years ago, it was
I really did something special. I gave you a gift by giving me a gift that we gave the world. So
and not only did you talk about your books on the Ramones, you hooked me up with Monty Melnick, the road manager of the Ramones. So I had him on, I think, the following episode. So you got us off to a good start here, man.
Yeah, well, Monty actually lived the life. I was just sort of the person that Monty turned to tell his story, because I can put together the words, but also I'm a big punk rock fan like yourself, so I kind of understood the context of stuff. But the reality is, like, On the Road with the Ramones, my first book, is Monty's story. And most of my stuff in the book world have kind of been me teaming up with people that are essentially more famous, i.e. have a more interesting story to tell, and then me helping them tell their story. So I worked with like Niels Lozauer. I actually worked with Dave Mustaine on his first book, although it changed hands a few times. I've worked with sports photographer Walter Yost Jr., just sort of helping people tell their stories. Of course, as a musician and a filmmaker, those are the medias where I'm telling my story. But in the world of books, my role has kind of become like a co-author, helping people tell their stories. And much like in the guitar world or in the music world, like when I'm in my band, the Streetwalkin Cheetahs, I'm like the front guy. I'm singing, I'm playing guitar, and I'm kind of essentially writing or co-writing the songs. But when I work with a guy like James Williamson from the Stooges, I'm just the lead singer, and like he tells me what to do. When I'm working with other bands as a guitar player, if I'm working with like heavy metal artist Thor, I might just be playing guitar or working on that stuff, not necessarily the front person. So I always kind of understand that in this world of art, like everyone has their role.
By the way, thefrankmeyer.com is your website.
Thank you. Yeah, thefrankmeyer.com or thefrankmeyerdirector.com if you want to just hone in on my directing stuff. Because one thing, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've always been a real hardworking person. So like ever since I was young, I've kind of just like Like whatever it is I'm doing, I do it. Meaning I don't just like play in a band, I make a record with the band, or I go on tour with the band. I don't just get into making movies, I make movies. Like I write movies, I direct them. I worked at NBC for years. I made tons and tons of content there, in all sorts of roles, producer, director, writer. My whole thing is just like, especially in Los Angeles, like, forgive my French, but motherfuckers talk all day about the shit they've done and they ain't done shit. You know what I mean? Like people talk all day long in this town about like, man, blah, 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 blah. And then like when it comes down to it, you're like, man, you ain't done nothing. Like my whole thing is like Frank Zappa's my hero. So like I'm into output. Like I'm not into being an idea guy. I'm into being I wrote books guy, I directed movies guy, I made albums where I'm the singer, songwriter, guitar player, chief musician. I went on tour. I've been to Europe. I've been to, you know what I mean? Like I'm into the like, I'm gonna prove it to you. I'm not talking about stuff. Talking is what people do. You go to the bar, you hang out, this guy, oh man, I'm playing in this band, do all this stuff. You go, where can I get this? You on Spotify? And they go, oh, well, no, none of this, it's not like released or anything. You're like, You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
I'm not that guy. I'm the guy where it's like, if I got something to say and I'm going to spend the time and do it, then it's coming out on a label and it's going to get some marketing and I'm going to go out and tour and support it. And and if I can't have a budget, then to have people direct my videos and make my videos and edit my videos, I'll do it all myself because I learned how to do that too along the way.
Well, you got a new project, so we want to talk about. Well, actually, I want to ask you about Van Halen because we're huge Van Halen fans, and you got great David Lee.
Who isn't?
Yeah.
Who in America, in the world, isn't?
Who doesn't love Van Halen?
For crying
I want
out
to.
loud.
Yeah, we'll talk metal. We'll talk punk. Books on rock that you've read. Books on rock that you want to see written. But let's start with your brand new project. Just had author Ben Apatow on the podcast. He wrote a great book for the 33 1/3 series on Ice-T's metal band Body Count, which you should read if you haven't yet.
I have not, and I am a huge Ice-T fan. Frank Zappa and Ice-T and Eddie Van Halen, like those are my guys.
Yeah, and he's in your documentary. Let's talk about this documentary. Ice-T among the many artists, part of a documentary which has just been released. Tell us about this documentary.
So Freestyle 101 Hip Hop History. It's out on Amazon Prime and YouTube Movies and Google Play. And essentially it's the history of freestyle rap, but it's also sort of examining the idea of like being an artist and being like an expert in your craft, and like what does that mean in terms of trying to create like a career when in the case of music everything is like being an expert in a craft isn't necessarily like a formula for success in the pop music world. You've got to write hooks, you've got to have an image, you've got to have so many things behind you. Just being a dope guitar player that can shred or a super great freestyle rapper, like maybe in the 90s, you might have been something that could get you signed. But like nowadays, like, you know what I mean? Like being like an expert in this super, super specific lane of hip hop or rock or whatever you do is not necessarily a guaranteed way to make a living. So the movie kind of starts off with like the history of freestyle rap, meaning improvisational rap. So it's not just rapping, but the idea that guys are like battling and going against each other, or doing improv rap where they're like working with like the stuff in the room and the people in the room and the things that are happening and kind of making their lyrics up instead of coming in with predetermined lyrics. That became like an art form and an offshoot within hip hop. And so we examine like the history of that with Chuck D narrating, Ice-T, Mobb Deep, M.O.P., Fat Joe, Del, Cypress Hill, The Game, RZA, Guru, all these people telling you kind of the history of it. And then we kind of catch you up to with modern day where it's like, okay, so if you're on the West Coast and you're like this super dope backpack rapper that came from like the Freestyle Fellowship, Good Life, Project Blowed, you can rap your ass off, and maybe you're even writing songs now. Okay, there's that guy. And then on the East Coast, that's manifested itself in like you're the dopest battle rapper, and you can just come in and annihilate dudes. And there's like, it's like boxing. There's there's money on the line. There's sponsorships. You got Diddy and Busta Rhymes up in the balcony, giving their thumbs up and thumbs down. It's like some ruthless, real like sportsmanship stuff. So okay, you got these two guys now who come from this philosophy of being an improvisational monster. Again, I equate it, because I come from the guitar world, I equate it to being like the dopest guitar player in town. Like, back in the day when it was like Eddie Van Halen versus Randy Rhoads, Warren DeMartini versus Jakey Lee, Zach Wilde versus Dimebag Darrell. You know what I mean? You had like these shredding lead guitar players like, man, that dude, that's my guy over there with that fucking dude will tear your head off. And people are like, no, man, Eddie Van Halen's my shit. Fucking that guy's a clown. That's the way it became in like freestyle rapping. So the movie kind of like gives you the history, then takes you up with these modern guys, and then kind of poses the question of like, what does that get you in the modern music industry? Like, what does that get you in the music industry now to be an expert at something? But can you package that, and can you make that essentially a sellable commodity in this version of the music industry? Because this version of the music industry is very different than the one where that art form was created in the 80s and 90s, you know what I'm saying, or 70s, blah, blah, blah.
To me, that these guys can come up with stuff off the top of their head.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. It's mind-blowing.
What I learned is that not every rapper, is a great freestyler, but every rapper started with freestyling. In fact, what I learned, because the movie is essentially based on, I started doing a podcast in the very early days of podcasting, like 2008. I was doing a podcast called Freestyle 101, and I was having rappers come on, and I was kind of posing the question of like, let's talk about how you learned to rap, where you came from, who your influences were, and the first time you freestyled. And I knew that every rapper didn't necessarily become a freestyle rapper, but I knew that every rapper started off improvising and rhyming with their buddies and doing a cipher and, banging on the table at school, banging on the walls in their fucking projects where they work, you know what I mean? Like trading fucking barbs with dudes, battling. So I understood much. Again, I go back to guitar playing, much like you could talk to any guitar player, like, tell me when you just started fucking learning how to do leads and like competing with guys. Like, oh shit, first time I had to, trade licks with a guy. Like, everyone knows that doesn't mean that's what you did with your career, but that was a good talking point for having a conversation. Because what I thought is that, like, I've read a million interviews with Eddie Van Halen and Keith Richards and Pete Townsend about the intricacies of their guitar playing. I was not reading a lot or seeing a lot of interviews with rappers about the intricacies of what they were doing on the microphone. But I was reading interviews with rappers about, like, when did you sell crack and how many times did you get shot, and like all that like crime life stuff, which I'm not saying that context doesn't like provide insight into their art form, but I'm like, that's the most interesting thing you've got to ask this dude. Like, this guy's doing incredible like, these rappers are just like the greatest poets in the world, and all you want to know is whether they sold crack. So I was like, man, I want to talk to rappers about rapping, and I just thought freestyling was like a good like jumping off point. And then the idea was like, we would talk about it, and then I would get them on the mic, and if they could freestyle, I would encourage them freestyle, to give me one off the cuff. But if they couldn't, as some rapper, Ice-T told me, he goes, look, I'm not really a freestyle. Like, it's fine, man. Just do your thing. I'll talk to you about that as a jumping off point. But when you get on the mic, just do your thing. And like, it's cool if you just come in with a written or change a few words. Like, my whole thing is I just wanted the musical performance to be one take. I didn't want them doing punch-ins and like making a recording. So the idea was, come in, talk to me about your art form on a technical inside baseball level, and then let's see you just get on the mic just like you'd say to a guitar player, just like, give me one. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go. And then boom, and let them do their thing, and they go, hey, that's it. That's what we're going to use for you on this. And that became this podcast. And then once I had like 100 episodes of like every great rapper in the world talking and rapping about the same sort of subject matter, I was like, there's a movie in this. And that's essentially what this movie is.
You've talked in previous interviews about how you saw a little of punk in hip hop. Can you talk about that? Expand on that?
Well, the first exposure I had to hip hop was when I was like a little kid, probably in the late 80s. And it was like Run DMC and the Fat Boys and, DJ Jazzy Jeff and Fresh Prince, like the meaning like pop hip hop that was on the radio. But like, how could you not love Run DMC? And of course, if you loved rock and roll, they teamed up with Aerosmith, so there was some credibility. So I was like aware of hip hop, but definitely I was a rock kid. I listened to punk rock and heavy metal. I was listening to Van Halen and Motley Crue and Judas Priest and Blondie and Devo and just like 80s rock. And I'll tell you a funny story. My stepdad was a entertainment attorney, and he represented everyone from Tom Petty to Yoko Ono to Eazy-E.
Wow.
And when NWA, Ice Cube left the group, and they were doing an interview on a show called Pump It Up with a host named Dee Barnes, and she asked them about Ice Cube leaving, and Easy and Dre got pissed and essentially beat her up and threw her down a flight of stairs. And she sued them. This is not in the movie Straight Outta Compton, but it is widely acknowledged, even in their HBO documentary about Dr. Dre and Ivy, and they talk about this. And so she sued them for assault. And my dad represented Eazy-E in that assault charge, you know what I mean?
Wow.
So he was representing Easy. So my dad comes home one day and he's like, I'm working with this guy named Eazy-E, and he's got a record company called Ruthless, and he gave me some CDs. I'm not going to listen to them. You want them? And it was like the Easy record, the NWA, Straight Outta Compton, 100 Miles and Running, Ziggas for Life, the third record, Above the Law, which was another group on the label, a few other like Ruthless things. And I wasn't that into hip hop. And so I was probably going to go sell them, like at the record store down the street. But I was like, I know that NWA group did that song, Fuck the Police. And I do fucking hate the police. So I do enjoy that overall sentiment. And the punk rocker in me, this is where I'm finally answering your question.
Yeah.
Was like, yeah, I do like that. So I was like, well, let me check out this record Straight Outta Compton. I put that on and boom, I was like, boom, my fucking brain just exploded. And what I equated to punk rock with it is that like, it was so direct. It was so in your face. Like these guys didn't even learn how to play guitar. They didn't even scales, chords, like, that's too formal. Like hip hop to me was so punk rock. They were just like guitars, bass and drums, fuck that, boom, like fuck that shit. Like it was so like they just threw the whole thing out the window. And then also I felt like the Clash and the Damned and the Sex Pistols would be clever about how anti-authority they were. You know what I mean? Like they would write like, kind of like a more clever poem, but like NWA was just like, fuck the police. Like literally just like, I will shoot them in the face. And I was like, damn, like they've taken all the sort of silly bullshit out of the equation and just boiled it down to like heat and anger and frustration over a dope beat that sounds like rebel music.
Yeah.
That to me made such perfect sense. And like, I've spent the rest of my life to this day as an investigative journalist, as a filmmaker, as a musician, just, perplexed and just fascinated with what hip hop did to me in that moment and what hip hop can do, and music in general, punk rock, heavy metal too. But for me, maybe more than anything, hip hop, I had that moment where I was like, man, anything is possible in this world. Anything is possible.
I want to go back to body count. You were telling my friend Darren Paltrowitz recently on his podcast, the Paltrowcast, that you saw Body Count in concert, and that was an insane experience for you. Tell the story again. They came out with Uzis.
Well, the show that I saw was at a heavy metal club on the Sunset Strip that I think was called the Spice Club. It might have been called Sunset Live or something, but I want to say it was called the Spice Club, and that there was a promoter around that time named Rich Bartle, and he was kind of connected, and that he had Body Count play, and I think it was a warm-up show for the Lollapalooza tour, which was sort of how they were introduced to the world. Was like Ice-T was already a famous rapper, and he had just put out the album Original Gangster, and Original Gangster had a song called There Goes the Neighborhood featuring Body Count, and that was the first introduction to Body Count. And around that time, him and Ernie C., who was his childhood, high school buddy, who's been making records with all these years. The very first Ice-T footage you ever see in the movie Breakin' and Rappin', Ernie C. is by his side. Ernie C. has always been there with Ice-T.
Kick-ass guitarist, too.
Kick-ass guitarist, great songwriter, great guy. He's the guy that hooked me up with Ice to get him in my movie. So he introduced them on that record, and they played a handful of local shows. I have a bootleg video of them playing Raji's, which was a punk rock club. Like, they probably did like maybe 4, 5, 6 local shows at like heavy metal, Sunset Strip, hair metal type clubs before they went on that Lollapalooza tour. And I saw one of those shows. I would wild guess it was somewhere around show number like 4, 5, or 6, And what I remember was that at that time, Public Enemy would do this thing where like the S1Ws, like their crew, full military outfits, but they had like very clearly these kind of cardboard Uzis, meaning it was theatrical. Meaning like when you saw Public Enemy and they were doing all that militant stuff, much like seeing Alice Cooper or Wasp or something, like there was a sense of theatrics. They weren't trying to convince you that they had guns. They were just trying to show you like, we are a militant force. You know what I mean? Like, it was theatrics. But when I saw this show with Ice-T, these motherfuckers, they just had dudes coming out in full prison outfits, like real prison outfits, holding actual fucking Uzis and AKs. Like, they weren't cardboard. And I have no idea if they were loaded. I would fucking hope they weren't. But like, I was like, whoa. Like, I was a little kid and I was like, damn, those are guns. And then the main other thing that I remember about the show is that they started There Goes the Neighborhood, and right when the band kicked in, somehow they kind of fucked up. Like they stumbled, you know what I mean? Like, they didn't all come in. And Ice stopped the show and went, nope, no, we're going to start it over. And he had Ernie C. start the whole thing over again. I don't know whether it's maybe they were filming or maybe he's just a perfectionist, but like, they started the song, the first song of this very early gig, and they sort of stumbled and he stopped them cold, had them start over again. Then they went into it flawlessly and then just brutalized us. And man, I'm telling you, like, I'm so glad I grew up in Hollywood in that time. Like, in the late 80s, early 90s, I saw so many unbelievable, incredible shows like that. Saw Guns N' Roses unsigned, saw Poison unsigned, saw Jane's Addiction unsigned, saw Body Count early on.
In the clubs?
Yeah, I saw Warrant before Jani Lane was the singer. I saw Jani Lane in Plain Jane before he was in Warrant. Like, I saw Axl Rose when he was in a band called Rapid Fire, before Hollywood Rose, before Rose. When he first got off the bus, he answered a recycler ad and did 4 or 5 shows with a heavy metal band called Rapid Fire. I saw one of those shows opening up for Steve Vai on the Flexible tour at the Country Club. And I went because my pal Dweezil Zappa, as I told you, my guitar teacher, he was like, hey man, Frank's guitar player just left the band, but he's doing this solo tour and he's my pal and I'm going to be jamming with him. I'm going to put you on the list. And I was such a dumb little kid that, like, I asked my parents, like, will you guys take me to go see Dweezil play with this guy Steve Vai? And they were like, no. And so I asked my friends' parents, and they were like Frank Zappa fans, and they were like, okay, sure, we'll go. What time does it start? And I just looked at the flyer, or I looked at like the ticket Dweezil gave me or whatever, and it said like 8 o'clock, meaning like doors, 8 o'clock. And I was just like, I guess we've got to be there at 8 o'clock. So we got there at, probably 7:45, but 8 o'clock meant there was a band at 8, a band at 9, a band at 10, and then Steve Vai went on at 11 o'clock. The very first band that went on was called Rapid Fire, and it featured Axl Rose on vocals.
What were they playing? Covers, originals? Do you remember?
They're playing originals. If you can go online right now and look up Axl Rose Rapid Fire. They have a song called Rumble. And here's the connection, is that for years and years and years before I even understood, like, meaning from my point of view at that time, I just went and saw an unknown band that no one's ever heard of called Rapid Fire. But what I remember is that they had this fucking song called Rumble. And it went, when you want to and was like, oh man, where do you want to go? The Rumble, like the Warriors, like the Wanderers. I was like, my little teenage brain, I'd never seen I'd only seen professional bands at that point. So like now I'm watching, like I'm probably 14 and I'm watching a bunch of like 17 or 18-year-olds, like kids, and they're playing original music, and he's doing this song, Where Do You Want to Go, the Rumble. And I went up when they finished, and there was only like 12 people there when they played. I went up to the singer, long-haired, red-haired, skinny kid, and said, hey man, can I get your autograph? And he went, what? Why would you want that? And I go, because your band was incredible. I loved it. And he goes, all right. And by the way, he gave me I didn't save it, of course, but it didn't even say Axl Rose. It probably said William Bailey. I mean,
right,
he wasn't Axl yet. So, but I didn't know any of this. So then I saw Guns N' Roses, another story, if you want to hear it, I'll tell you. But I saw Guns N' Roses a few times in the early days before they got signed. And then, then they become big and yada yada. Years and years later, around 2000, I was the editor of KNAC.com, the heavy metal online radio station website. And we got sent a CD and a press kit from Cleopatra Records. And it was from a band called Rapid Fire. And the press kit said, this was Axl Rose's band. A heavy metal band. He didn't write the songs necessarily. He just like joined them right when he got off the bus before he split and then did Rose and then Hollywood Rose and yada yada. And I'm reading this because they sent it to me presumably to review it. And I'm going, I remember seeing a band called Rapid Fire, but there's no fucking way it was Axl Rose's band. That would just be too weird. And all I knew of them is that they had that song Rumble. So I skim down the press release and I see the CD and it says the track listing. First song, Rumble. And then in parentheses, where do you want to go? And I'm like, what the fuck? And I put it on and I'm like, that's it. That's the band I saw. And I realized like, oh my God, I saw Rapid Fire with Axl Rose doing this song. And I asked him for his autograph and everything.
That's like
Isn't that insane?
An obscure part of rock history that very few can
and
say.
I'll give you one other weird little sort of tidbit to that story is that now cut to, so if that was probably 84, by 86, Guns N' Roses were kind of a known local band and had been signed, but their record didn't come out till 87. So there was like a year where they were signed, but the record wasn't out. And in that time, I saw them open for Jet Boy. I saw them with Vane. I saw them play at UCLA in Ackerman Hall on Halloween night, 86, with Red Hot Chili Peppers, Thelonious Monster, and the Dickies. I saw a lot of weird shows.
So GNR was on the same bill as the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
In 1986, UCLA, Ackerman Hall, and there's a bootleg of it, and it was the first night they played the song Perfect Crime, I think, actually. But anyway, so yeah, we're going way back. This is, by the way, this is all on the internet. You can look all this shit up.
Yeah, man, that's cool. Boy, you've got story. You've always got stories.
But so here's the other stories. So I saw Axl in that band, but I don't remember. I never made that connection until much later. But now it's like 86, and it's the second annual MTV Music Awards ever. And my pal, Dweezil Zappa, was not hosting the awards, but he was a MTV host at this time. And him and Moon were like hosting on MTV. And so it was the second annual Music Awards, and Moon and Dweezil were going to go up and do some sort of presentation thing. So Dweezil says, hey man, I'm going on this MTV thing. You should come with me and hang out and be my guest. So all right. So I go to that. We're in this backstage area where there's like a dance floor, and there's this long line of free food, like a catering area of free food. And I see Axl and Slash, who at this point I've seen in Guns N' Roses, and I did not know that I was not making the connection.
Still didn't make the connection.
Rapid Fire, But I had seen Guns N' Roses at that point, and they were a popular LA band. And I even think I knew they had a record deal, but the record was not out. They were not famous yet. I see them because, this time Slash has still got the top hat, Axls. I mean, they look like exactly like they looked in the Welcome to the Jungle video, basically in the full leather outfit. But I see them on the catering line, and they're so poor because they're not famous yet. They're taking bread and pastas and like shoving it in their jacket and like stealing food. And so I'm like, oh man, that's those fucking Guns N' Roses guys. So I walk up to them and I go, "Hey, are you Axl and Slash?" And I'm a little kid, like, I mean, I'm probably 14 at this point, but they're maybe in their early 20s. And I go, "Hey, are you Axl and Slash?" And they're like they thought they got busted. They're like, maybe. And I go, "Oh no, I saw you guys last weekend in San Francisco with Jet Boy." And they're like, "Oh yeah." And I go, "And I'm gonna go see you guys next week with the Red Hot Chili Peppers." And now they're kind of warming up to me. They're like, "Yeah, all right, kid. Yeah, cool." And I go, "The Red Hot Chili Peppers are known for playing totally naked and putting socks on their dicks. So like, what are you guys going to do? Are you guys going to just walk out totally naked?" And just like out of Spinal Tap, like Axl turns to Slash and he goes like, "Hey man, this kid says we should walk out naked and show our dicks." And Slash was like, like Beavis and Butthead,
Yeah.
like, "Show our dicks. That's cool." And he was like, "All right, cool, kid." And that was my Guns N' Roses story.
Oh man. The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Frank Meyer, he's our guest. Brand new documentary, Freestyle 101 Hip Hop History. Amazon Prime, Google Play, YouTube Movies. You can find them there. Let's talk books on rock now. Let's start with books on rock you've recently read and you want to talk about. You read Steve Rosen's brand new book released this year, Tone Chaser, Understanding Edward, My 26-Year Journey with Edward Van Halen. The promo for the book stated that the book is, quote, "an honest, up-close look at what it was like to be friends with the greatest guitar player on the planet." Did the book live up to that promise? And what are some standout moments from the book for you?
I really liked the book. A lot of it is because I'm just an Eddie Van Halen junkie. And so there's a lot of just transcriptions of late night conversations with Eddie. And I don't know that that's for everybody, but like I'm the audience for that. Like I want to, I assume when I read something like that Eddie's probably calling like after several beers or several lines of Coke, and we're getting like the raw fucking Eddie. And I also assume that like, all right, the raw fucking Eddie calling a journalist, on/off the record at 4 a.m. may or may not be like the best example of Eddie's overall personality, but like, I want to hear that interview. You know what I mean? Like, I love Eddie and I'm such a fan that I'm fascinated by those conversations. What I liked about that book is that Steve was a journalist who was sort of in awe of Eddie, and he made the mistake that sometimes we journalists make, and I say that with love, is that he got too close. You know what I mean? Like he formed a personal relationship with Eddie to where he felt responsible and beholden and emotionally attached to him, so that when Eddie, who had a lot of other stuff going on in his life besides his conversations and relationship with this journalist, when Eddie essentially kind of blew him off, Steve got very hurt by that. And there's some raw stuff in the book, and some of it I don't even know that I feel like Steve comes off particularly great in, but I love the fact that he wrote this fucking book and left all that shit in. So much like he left Eddie's raw personality out on the floor, I feel like he left his own raw personality out on the floor, because there's a lot of stuff in the end where you're like, man, maybe he's just over this relationship and he's moved on, and like you're sort of fixated on it, but like he's not, and that doesn't make him a bad guy. But like the fact that Steve as a journalist was able to be that honest and kind of let you into that side of that conversation, I just thought was really cool. So I really like that book a lot.
Well, that's the question I have for you as an author, because he was on Eddie Trunk's show, and Eddie Trunk was talking about how apparently it's in the book. There are quotes that Eddie gave off the record and that they're in the book. And Eddie Trunk asked him about that. Like, did you have doubts about that? Why did you decide to put them in? And he gave his response. What would you do in that situation if you have somebody who says this is off the record?
Well, I didn't hear the interview with Eddie Trunk, so I can't comment on that.
I do remember what his response was. I mean, it was basically that he said these are all things that Eddie ended up saying later that were published.
Well, okay, so again, you tell me that. So my first instinct is, as a journalist, even if I were to release the raw transcripts of something, if there was a section where the artist or the subject matter specifically said essentially we're off the record, then I would not put that in. And again, I'm not capping on Steve or anything. I'm just saying I wouldn't. However, if what you're telling me is that now that Eddie's passed away, and in the overall body of interviews that Eddie did since then, that all this stuff was essentially revealed. So while Eddie at that moment might have been like, we're off the record, all that information got released anyways and is now part of the sort of lore of his story, then yeah, at that point I go like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think Steve's fine. Put it this way. In either conversation, my take is that Steve did a very good, responsible job with that book. And I feel like he lays Eddie's heart on the line, but he lays his own heart on the line. And neither one of them come off unscathed. As a fan, all of the highlight stuff to me is, there's a part where Steve talks about kind of like running into Valerie Bertinelli and kind of chasing her down the street and being kind of like, hey, remember me? We used to hang. And she's sort of like, yeah, I remember you. Like, get the fuck away from me. And she's like with her kid. And like, it's a moment where, and I don't know if Steven intended this, but like, it's a moment where all of a sudden this guy who is this, in the zone journalist suddenly sort of seems like a stalker or like a super fan. And you can see where Valerie's kind of like, what the fuck? Like, why are you, I'm with my kid. But what I thought was so great about that moment is that like, it was such an honest moment, meaning like, the fact that Steven included that moment, again, I don't know where he was at, whether he thought that was a chivalrous moment or an embarrassing moment, but the fact that he included that and kind of like let us know like, hey man, I'm this guy and we were in each other's lives, but now like I walk up to this woman I once knew and she kind of fucking treats me like I'm just like a stranger. It was a super, super brutally honest moment, and one that didn't make the author seem all that flattering. But at the same time, for me as a author and a creative, I went, whoa, like that's some ballsy ass shit to put that in. Now I know you're really telling a story here, and this isn't just like Eddie and I were so cool. You know what I mean? Like now you're giving me some really honest, uncomfortable stuff that like could be read a few different ways. And like, I don't know, I really appreciated that. And that to me made that book feel like maybe like the most real story of knowing Eddie Van Halen.
Another book you read is 2017's For the Sake of Heaviness, The History of Metal Blade by author Brian Slagle with Mark Eglinton. Forward by Lars Ulrich. What an amazing story. The label that helped launch Metallica and Rat and went on to become the preeminent international home of heavy music that it is today started out of Brian Slagle's mom's non-air-conditioned garage.
In the early days of the music industry, and I say the early days meaning the early days of the independent version of the music industry, when people were starting to make independent records outside of being like Warner Brothers or CBS or, whatever, is you had people like in the punk world, you had people like Greg Shaw, who were doing stuff with like Iggy Pop and the Plimsouls and Josie Cotton and like, K-rock stuff, like the early days of independent, like new wave music in Los Angeles. And then you had guys like Brian Slagle, who were doing the heavy metal version of that, doing like independent heavy metal based out of Los Angeles, based on that music scene. And Brian Slagle created Metal Blade Records, and Metal Blade went on to put on all sorts of bands, but the first compilation that Metal Blade put out was called Metal Massacre, and there was subsequent many versions, Metal Massacre 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And these records essentially were showcasing the best of West Coast heavy metal in 1982 or 3 or 4 or whatever year we're talking about. And the first one featured the first released Metallica song before the band was even, Hit the Lights. It's the original demo version of Hit the Lights, and it's very, very raw and early sounding. That song appeared on Kill 'Em All, but this version predates that. I want to say it even predates Dave Mustaine on guitar. I think it's Ron Govney on guitar, maybe, but it's a very early version of Metallica. It's got Black and Blue. It's got Rat doing, I think Tell the World is on that, but it's an early version of Rat, again, like before Warren DeMartini, like before all that stuff. It's got Cirith Ungol. It's got Bitch. Basically, Brian Slagle was the West Coast impresario of heavy metal in the early 80s, and he was almost single-handedly putting heavy metal on the map and showcasing all of the best bands. And that platform of being showcased on these heavy metal compilation albums, and then in some cases like Armored Saint, they went on to make records for Metal Blade. In some cases, like bands like Rat went on to other labels to make their albums. But by being showcased in Metal Blade, it kind of became a launch pad. So if you were on one of these Metal Massacre records, like, you could probably get a record deal. So a lot of bands, Lizzie Borden, Pandemonium, all these bands were like popping their first song off on these compilations and then getting a record deal or signing with Metal Blade. So Brian Slagle to me is just kind of a fascinating guy, because he signed Metallica, he signed Rat, he signed Black and Blue, he signed Armored Saint, Cirith Ungol, Lizzie Borden, Bitch. Just so many great, LA metal bands. And like, that's the era I grew up in, LA punk and LA metal. Brian was involved in Metallica from day one, and the early version of Metallica had a few different people in it before Dave Mustaine even joined, and before Cliff Burton joined. So there was a guy named Ron McGovney, and I don't remember the other guys, but a few other dudes that were involved in Metallica in that first, say, year before the early lineup solidified. And that early lineup featured Mustaine, and then Mustaine was out. So the Kill 'Em All lineup that we know with Kirk Hammett on guitar is by no means the first lineup of Metallica. That's just the first, like, on a label version of Metallica. There was probably 3 or 4 different lineups before that, and I think because Brian Slagle was involved with Lars early on, and Lars was a kid, I don't remember the exact timeline, but I think basically Lars was a kid, he was from the Netherlands, and he rolled out to LA, and he went to some heavy metal shows, and he met Brian Slagle and gave him a demo. And then as soon as he heard about the Metal Massacre compilation, like, assembled Metallica basically to get on this compilation. So Lars and Brian Slagle have been connected since day one of Lars's career in the United States.
Another book you wanted to talk about, 911 is Disconnected. So This Is Rock and Roll by Adam Baum from 2017. This is the autobiography of Adam Baum-Brenner. He's played with the bands TKO, Black and Blue, Steel Pulse, John Paul Jones, and Michael Monroe. Worked with those two guys too. From Seattle, he was in a cover band with Jeff Tate of Queensryche in 1979, auditioned for Kiss in 1982, which would be around the time Vinnie Vincent joined. Shared an apartment with Izzy Stradlin of GNR, recorded with AC/DC bassist Cliff Williams, and there's a story of backstage guitar lessons from Eddie Van Halen in the book.
Well, so I'll give you a little backup on that, is that when I was a teenager, the radio stations in Los Angeles, which for me were like KLOS and KMET, used to do like heavy metal nights. So there would be like Sunday or Saturday, it's like metal shop or metal school. And at midnight, it's 1 hour of just pure metal. And when I was a kid, I would just like stay up with my like ghetto blaster tape recorder and tape record those shows, because that's where I would hear Armored Saint, Lizzie Borden, Wasp, Queensryche, like all the like real metal before that stuff was like, getting played, before any of those bands had hits, and when it was like old school underground stuff, not old school, underground stuff. One night I heard this song on KMET or KLOS or one of those, I Want My Heavy Metal by Atom Bomb. And I was like, man, I want my heavy metal. Like, I was like, I'm a young teenage youth. Like, I get it. I loved this song. I ran out. I bought the record. Turns out it had Cliff Williams on bass. You were talking about AC/DC, Jimmy Crespo from Aerosmith on guitar. And it was just like this sort of snotty, punky, Aerosmithy kind of vibe. And I really loved it. So that is where I first got turned on to Atom Bomb. Now, many years later, after he'd worked with people like Michael Monroe, a big hero of mine, Hanoi Rocks, John Paul Jones and stuff, I got to meet him, the Cheetahs, the Streetwalkin Cheetahs, the punk rock band I play in. We did some shows with them. We became pals. And all these years later, he and I did some touring together. But he wrote this book about his whole career. And his career starts off in, the Seattle metal scene had bands like Queensryche and early versions of like Black and Blue, they were actually from Portland, but Tommy Thayer. Yeah, well, him and Tommy Thayer go way back. He plays on some early Black and Blue stuff. There's like all those like Portland, Seattle metal guys from like 82, 83 were all kind of like connected and stuff. And so he stemmed from that. He played in this great band called TKO. He played in a band called, I think they were called The Warning, with Jeff Tate from Queensryche. Then he went on to become Atom Bomb, the solo artist, and that's the record I heard, the I Want My Heavy Metal stuff. Then he went on to do all this other stuff. So he wrote a book about all this stuff. I think just what I love about it is I'm a really nerdy, as you could tell, like I'm a really kind of nerdy music fan. Like if I'm into glam rock, I want to know everything about the glam rock bands I'm into. If I'm into gangster rap, I want to know everything about the Ghetto Boys, or whoever I'm fascinated with. If I'm into jazz and all of a sudden I'm like, man, Sonny Chirac, Pharoah Sanders, like what? Like then bam, I got to get way deep into those crevices and really like wrap my head around like what, why.
That's why we love these books, because books are great for that stuff. They go deep.
And so the Atom Bomb one is fun because like there's not a lot of books about that scene we were just talking about, the Portland, Seattle heavy. Like there's a lot of books about the LA metal scene, the Brian Slagle one, but there's not a lot about the Portland, Seattle, early 80s heavy metal scene. And so what I liked about Adam's book is that even if you don't know who Atom Bomb is, if you like heavy metal and you want to like get some insight into like, well, while Rat and Motley Crue was happening in LA, like what was going on in Seattle and Portland? Well, there was this whole other scene and it birthed all these bigger bands. But back then it was just this underground scene of like cover bands and original metal bands that no one gave a shit about, but like were amazing. You know what I mean?
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Now let's get to books that you want to read. 2011's Life by Keith Richards. Another one you have, it's called Smack by, and you got to help me with this pronunciation. Is it Jarkko Jokelainen?
Sure, we'll say that, yeah.
From 2021. I looked on the internet just to see if somebody interviewed him just so they can pronounce his name, but I couldn't find anything. So,
well, Smack is an amazing glam, sort of gothy glam band from the 80s out of Finland that I'm fascinated with. And I'm actually in that book. They interviewed me for it because I saw a bunch of early Smack shows when they moved to LA.
The Flaming Sideburns, right?
The Flaming Sideburns, that's basically all part of the sort of Finnish music scene, essentially. Okay. But Smack was a big band out of that scene, and the main reason I put that as a book I want to read is that they've sent me the book. I don't speak Finnish, so I can't read the book. So I have it and I want to read it, but I am unable to read it.
Because I
Thank
can't
you.
read it.
I literally can't read it. I'm in the book and I can't even read my own interview. Like
awesome.
I look at it, it goes Frank Meyer, blah 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 blah. And I'm like,
That's
fuck, I don't
great.
know. Is that even accurate? I don't even remember what I said, but I certainly can't fact check it.
Yes.
The Keith book is on there simply because I'm such a Stones nerd that I've read so many Stones books that by the time the Keith book came out, I was like, first off, I've heard all the stories. Second off, do I really think Keith wrote this book? No fucking way. You know Keith, like he just hired some ghostwriter and just went like, "Ah, mate, yeah, 1973, he was out there with the blokes who were fucking, yeah, look it up, mate, look it up on the fucking internet, yeah, all over here." You know, he didn't fucking write that book. And I don't know, just something about it in a weird way. I was like, Keith's like the one person I don't want to hear from in all these scenarios, because he's always the mysterious stranger. He's always the instigator. He's always like John Lennon was fine until he met Keith. He's like this shadowy figure that just like people are in white and then Keith moves across the screen and boom, they're in black or they're like drenched in blood. You know what I mean? So I'm like, man, I don't want to fucking hear Keith's story. So like, but then when you said to me, like, what books do you want to read? I'm like, I mean, Keith.
It's the 4th biggest selling rock book of all time. Estimated 100,000 plus copies sold. Now, you know this as an author. If you get to if you sell 5,000, that's like a gold record. If you sell 10,000, that's like platinum selling album, right? And that's, I remember one author told me that's the.
I don't think we have to debate whether Keith has been successful in every part of his career. And I'm not one on any level to disparage Keith, because I'll flat out say Rolling Stones, my all-time favorite band.
So let's get to the question.
So meaning this is not, if anything, this is petty jealousy. In fact, put an X through my face right now. I meaning I should be fully supporting Keith. I don't even know why I brought it up. I'm just saying, like, I haven't read it. So you said, what books do you want to read? Okay, you know what? Remove the X.
Yeah.
You said, what books do you want to read? And I honestly said Keith because I haven't read it. And I'm telling you, the reason is that because like I feel like it's oversaturated. But now that I talked through that, I realize I'm ridiculous.
Hey, pure honesty here. I have not read it yet. I'm kind of ashamed of myself because I should have read it by now.
Then we're both should be ashamed for each other, really.
Tell me about Hackney Diamonds, because to me, this album is fucking awesome. And I'm blown away by these guys at 80 years old can make an album like this that sounds so youthful and energetic and focused. Like, this album is really, like, every single song is a home run to me. I'm just blown away by it, because normally you get to artists at a certain age, you can hear that they sound tired. Maybe they're not into it as much. This is anything but that. What do you think?
I agree. It's a great record. I wouldn't say I was surprised, because I actually really liked Bigger Bang and I liked Voodoo Lounge, like their last 2 studio records. And I know that that's like over the course now of 16 years. It's like, but I actually thought
better. To me, this is
it's a great record.
Tattoo You for me.
I will say probably my least favorite song, and this is often the case when bands I love make new records, but the least favorite song is the first single. Angry to me is fine.
Yeah.
I would say it's my absolute least favorite song on the record. It's like any band doing the Stones. That being said, every other song on the record is the Stones being the Stones, and just sounds like them just really making a goddamn real rock and roll record. And it sounds very live. But when I first heard Angry, and I didn't necessarily, I'm a Stones guy, so like I was like, okay, whatever. There's going to be like 16 songs. This is one of them. This is just the one the record company wanted to put out. But that song to me kind of doesn't do much for me.
No? Did you know that's Mick's riff?
whatever.
I
I'm
just
saying,
heard that's his
I mean,
riff. So it maybe
every other song on the record is great. And even like when Mick did that single with Dave Grohl a few years ago, like that thing was killer. Like I love Mick. Like, I'm a big Mick guy, but I'm not saying it's a bad song. I'm just saying that song to me is Stones just sort of by the numbers, whereas
yeah.
every other song sounds like them like, fighting and
Right. Yeah.
pushing and like just being like angry and not quite conforming to what we think,
Right.
like the song with Lady Gaga. That thing
yeah.
is whoa. Like at the end when the horn section comes in, it's got this whole kind of Let It Bleed vibe,
Yes.
and then there's a jam at the end, like Exile on Main Street. Like, man,
Well, there's the one track with the guy from Fits and the Tantrums plays the sax solo. That's, I think, the second or third track on the album.
oh, I didn't know that.
It's
And
amazing.
what's the name of the song with Paul McCartney? It's like the punk rock one.
Yeah, that's Bite My Head
like,
Off.
But it sounds like the New
Why
York
you
Dolls.
bite my head off?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
It's just, I'm so grateful that I mean, they didn't have to release another album or song again. They've already
The
put their
Stones have
time
nothing
in,
to prove to anybody. And
Yeah.
the fact that they're still not only making a record, but making essentially a great record is absolutely incredible and astounding.
and inspiring.
And inspiring.
As we get older, it's like, you know what? We could still rock and roll at the age of 80. Okay, that's cool. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's wrap things up with books you would like to see written that haven't been yet. You'd like to see either biographies or autobiographies on Michael Monroe, famously of Hanoi Rocks, Michael Anthony of Van Halen, Ghetto Boys, the hip-hop Southern rap pioneers from Houston, Texas. Now, Michael Anthony, this book, I don't know if we'll ever see it. I don't think he'll ever write it, but he said if I do, it's not going to have any dirt in it. However, if he were to write a book, what would you love to see him cover in the book if he were to write one? Because he must have seen so many stories that we've never heard before.
It's not even that I want him to like revel in the dirt, meaning like we can assume that Dave was doing all sorts of crazy stuff and that Eddie was a misunderstood genius. You know what I mean? Like I don't need to hear who fucked who and how many lines. What I am interested in is that, well, what's the line in Spinal Tap from Derek? He says, "I'm the lukewarm water buffalo." You know what I mean? I'm the one in between. Like,
Right.
He's the guy that no matter whether it was Eddie and Sammy or Eddie and Dave or whatever the dynamic was, Michael Anthony was always sort of like the peacekeeper until he wasn't in the band. And so that's sort of like the voice I'm interested in. I don't really care about like the gory details, but I am interested in that point of view because like Eddie really was this sort of super driven, misunderstood, and then later kind of chemically imbalanced genius, like a Beethoven, you know what I mean? And then you've got Dave, who was not the most musically proficient, but obviously had all sorts of talents and ideas and, lyrics and, just overall, I mean, there's no doubt Dave brought a lot to the band, but obviously Dave brought a lot of headache to the band. And so Michael, it seems like more so than Alex, because Alex is inherently aligned with his brother, Michael is the one guy who had like no beef in that fight. You know what I mean? So like that's the point of view. If he could be honest about that point of view, that's a fascinating book.
Would love to see that book. Let's hope it happens. Fingers crossed. All right, so let's wrap it up now. So let's let people know again about the documentary that's out now, Freestyle 101 Hip Hop History. Where can people find it? Where can people find you online? Tell us what's going on with your bands, anything you want to plug.
Sure, man. So I know we've been talking a lot about rock and roll stuff here, but the movie I made is about hip hop artists, and really what it's really about is like artistry and craftsmanship within music. And so I'm kind of exploring this scene within hip hop that if you don't know about it, is this really intricate improvisational scene where it's like cutthroat and battling and ciphers and MCs like really going at each other with like wordplay, and it's almost like swordsmanship, but like on a rap level. And then I kind of explore like where does that get you in the modern music industry, and we've got Chuck D and Ice-T and Mobb Deep and MLP and Cypress Hill and Wu-Tang Clan and all these great artists. So Freestyle 101 Hip Hop History is on Amazon Prime, it's on YouTube Movies, it's on Google Play, and you can check us out at freestyle101movie.com or any of our social medias, Freestyle 101 Hip Hop History, so you can look that up. You can look me up at thefrankmeyer.com or thefrankmeyerdirector.com from my director stuff, or look me up on Instagram at thefrankmeyer. As you'll see, I have a bunch of music stuff I do, a bunch of film stuff I do, a bunch of book stuff that I do. And I guess the main thing is I'm either kind of telling my own artistic story or I'm exploring the artistic stories of others. But where I get fascinated with in telling other people's stories is kind of like underdogs or people that are counted out, you know, or like really sort of specific genres where I'm like, look at this thing and where does this kind of like, what does this mean in the larger scheme of things? So like most of my movies, I produced a movie about Thor, the heavy metal guy. I am Thor, and he's like this, you know, gladiator rock guy trying to like make, you know, really put like gladiator metal on the scene. It's kind of it doesn't quite make sense, but you know, his whole dream's a little misconstrued, but boy, does it seem heartfelt. And then I made a movie called Risen, the story of Sharon Hellraiser Smith, which is about a Wu-Tang Clan rapper who has a brain aneurysm and loses his whole ability to rap and has to learn how to rap again. And then this movie about the history of freestyle rap. And it's like I kind of tell these like underdog stories, I guess.
Frank Meyer, the man of many hats, and the guest for episode 1 of Booked on Rock, and now the guest of episode 165.
Wow, 165.
I'm up to 165.
Congratulations to you, by the way. Look at you.
Up to 165.
That's a lot of work, dude. And by the way, I like your Eddie Van Halen stool in the background.
You see it back there? The EVH stool, courtesy of the Van Halen
and of
store.
Course, the Van Halen sign. I mean, I saw that right off the top.
You see the banner back there? Hell yeah, man.
Yeah, man. Wow, 165. That's congratulations.
All right, dude. Thanks so much.
You got it. Take it easy, brother.
Well, now, that was an adventure.
That was quite a show you put on today.
Well, let me just close this conversation by saying you are one unique individual.